There's been, some good news coming out of Latin America, where Latin America continues to be the one terrain where left politics has had some success of late. And this week saw a socialist victory in Peru.
Socialist candidate Pedro Castillo overtook right-wing rival Keiko Fujimori in Peru's presidential contest in the official vote count Monday after a late surge of rural ballots. But the race still teeters on a knife's edge. The count put Castillo at 50.1% and Fujimori at 49.9%, with over 94% of the vote counted. The tight result could lead to days of uncertainty and tension. On Sunday night, Peruvian TV showed scuffles between supporters of the two candidates in Lima.
That's right. The left-wing candidate, Pedro Castillo, came out of nowhere and achieved a stunning victory against the right-wing Keiko Fujimori, daughter of Peru's former dictator, Alberto Fujimori. Now, the election pitted two candidates with dramatically different visions for the country.
The two offered sharply divergent visions for the country that went through three presidents in a week last year. Fujimori pledged to follow the free market model in the world's second-largest copper producer. Castillo vowed to shake up the constitution and share mining profits with the poor.
Now, it's hard to overstate just how surprising this victory was. Peru is one of the bastions of neoliberalism, and just before the elections, few Peruvians had ever heard of Pedro Castillo. To the extent that there was a left-of-center candidate that was well-known in Peru, it was a woman named Veronica Mendoza. And while Mendoza is on the left, she's even done an interview with Jacobin, the class and stylistic differences between her and Pedro Castillo couldn't be more stark. Mendoza was born and raised in the capital of Lima and was educated in France. Pedro Castillo comes from the Andean region of Cajamarca, and he comes from the trade union movement, having led a successful teacher strike in 2017. He also ran a campaign that was proudly rooted in the working class. He did not try to shed his image as a rural worker in favor of a more polished city slicker type image. He ran on a simple yet effective slogan: "No más pobres en un país rico." No more poor people in a rich country. And that was his message throughout the campaign. And he promised to achieve that by reforming the country's constitution. And to hammer home that message, he would appear at campaign rallies and press events with a comically large pencil that he said he would use to rewrite the constitution.
Gracias a usted, mi estimada Juliana.
Gracias.
Honroso de estar en este espacio para saludar a usted, a su tribuna y al pueblo peruano.
Con el lápiz siempre en la mano usted.
Sí, yo creo que esta es la verdadera herramienta para sacar adelante al país. El Perú no necesita látigos, no necesita fusiles, necesita el lápiz, una herramienta de la cultura de la educación. Con esta vamos a escribir la nueva constitución hecha por el pueblo, mi estimada Juliana. Es lo que estamos planteando en el país.
That's right. In the video, he talks about how Peru doesn't need the whip or the rifle. They need the pencil because it is an instrument of education and culture. And with it, they will write the new constitution, a constitution written by the people. This message resonated with many Peruvians because the current constitution, which was imposed by the former dictator Fujimori after his shocking autogolpe or self-coup in 1993, basically enshrines neoliberal economic policies. According to an analysis by political analyst Andrea Moncada in America's Quarterly, quote, Castillo wants to call for national referendum to approve the creation of a constitutional assembly that would then draft a new constitution. His focus on the constitution follows one main goal: to change its economic chapter. As it is currently written, the state can only carry out business when authorized by specific legislation and when it is in the national interest to do so. The objective, then, is to modify this chapter so that the government is able to, for example, nationalize the mining and energy sectors, or to unilaterally modify contracts with corporations so that they pay more taxes. This would be a massive change in a country that has been one of the main stalwarts of neoliberalism in the region. To understand it, we have to go back to the 1990s when neoliberalism came to Peru by the hand of Fujimori and the IMF. Fujimori won an election in 1990 in a massive upset against Mario Vargas Llosa, the famous novelist who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2010. Vargas Llosa was the favorite in that election, and he ran on a platform of neoliberalism, while Alberto Fujimori, an outsider, ran against that platform. However, just days after taking office, he implemented neoliberalism. According to Gerardo Renique and Jacobin, quote, Fujimori adopted a two-pronged strategy, an IMF-inspired economic stabilization program and a counterinsurgency campaign informed by the Cold War national security doctrine. In a now familiar pattern that Naomi Klein has described as disaster capitalism, Fujimori announced a severe austerity program known as Fuji Shock a few days after taking office in early August 1990. The package eliminated price subsidies and social spending while drastically raising interest rates and taxes. A majority of Peruvians were thrown into absolute poverty, and only 8% of the adult population remained fully employed. Farmers in the tropical valleys on the eastern slopes of the Andes turned to growing coca as a way to survive. Now, Fujimori could be described as a neoliberal populist dictator. When his Congress tried to resist the economic program, he allied with the military and business leaders to dissolve the Peruvian Congress and take more power for himself. This was called, at the time, the autogolpe, or the Fuji golpe. You can see a pattern here. Fujimori then ran Peru with an iron fist, using death squads to murder thousands of his political opponents and sterilizing as many as 270,000 indigenous women. Think about that. He was finally defeated in 2000 after 10 years in power. He would flee to Japan to escape justice for various crimes, but in 2009, he was sentenced to prison for human rights abuses.
Former Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori has been convicted of murder and kidnapping in connection to death squad activities that took place during his autocratic 10-year reign. Fujimori was calm, waving to friends, and writing in a notebook as a special tribunal ruled there was no question he authorized the creation of the unit, which killed at least 50 people during a 15-month period.
Por consiguiente, la sentencia que se emite es condenatoria.
The 70-year-old was then sentenced to 25 years in prison.
So yeah, while Fujimori himself was sent to prison, Fujimorismo remained alive and well in Peru, mainly through the figure of his daughter, Keiko Fujimori. Keiko actually became the official first lady of Peru when she was 19, as her mother, Alberto's wife, left after a messy divorce in 1995, and he named her the first lady. And you know that expression, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? Well, I guess you could say that in this case, this Fujimori apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
After a week-long hearing and a ruling lasting 8 hours, Judge Richard Concepcion Carhuancho handed 3 years in jail to Peru's most powerful opposition leader. He said there was a risk Keiko Fujimori could flee, while prosecutors investigate claims she ran a criminal organization within her political party.
Criminal organization within her party. Wow, that sounds bad. So yeah, the campaign played out mostly along class and regional lines. According to Tony Wood in The Guardian, quote, the second round campaign at once dramatized and deepened Peru's stark socioeconomic, political, and cultural divides. First, it drew attention to the gulf separating the more prosperous coast from the poorer highland regions, which have a larger indigenous population. Castillo, who is from the northern mining region of Cajamarca, drew his support overwhelmingly from the highlands, which saw few of the benefits of the boom years of the 2000s and the early 2010s. The Lima-based elite's attitude to such disparities is perhaps best captured by a phrase Fujimori let slip during a presidential debate held in rural Cajamarca in early May, when she complained of having had to come all the way here. She said afterwards this was a reference to the difficulty of the journey. While Keiko did well along the coast, Castillo piled up huge margins in the highlands. This included astonishing victories in the regions most deeply affected by the armed conflict of the 1980s and 90s. He won 83% of the vote in Ayacucho and 89% of the vote in Puno, for instance. Now, much has been made of Castillo's left but not woke campaign, melding economic redistribution with more conservative views on social issues. Here is an interview he gave during the campaign where he says he is personally against abortion, euthanasia, same-sex marriage, and marijuana legalization.
¿Usted legalizaría el aborto o no?
Para nada.
¿La eutanasia?
Eso va a ser vamos a trasladar a la Asamblea Nacional Constituyente que se debata, pero personalmente no estoy de acuerdo.
¿La eutanasia?
También que se traslade, pero tampoco estoy de acuerdo.
¿El matrimonio igualitario para personas del mismo sexo?
y peor todavía.
Legalizar la marihuana.
Primero la familia. Estas dos instituciones que son la familia y la escuela deben ir de la mano.
Legalizar la marihuana tampoco.
Por supuesto que no. Al contrario, lo que tenemos que hacer es que todos los derechos constitucionales, las organizaciones tienen que tener, vamos a ver de qué manera contribuimos al Perú para que los peruanos, la riqueza del país sea para todos los peruanos, mi estimado Jaime.
¿Usted se ha percatado que es un conservador?
Yeah, at the end, the interviewer asks him if he realizes that he is a conservative. Now, it is worth pointing out that while he said that he is personally opposed to those things, he did say that he would respect whatever the new Constitutional Assembly decided to do in regards to those social issues. So, by the narrowest of margins, Peru has lurched left, as The Economist put it, which is great news, obviously. But there will be challenges ahead. For starters, Peru has had the highest COVID death rate in the world and is facing a deep crisis as a result. But beyond that, Pedro Castillo will face major restraints to implement his agenda. The first restraint is purely political. According to Andrea Moncada, while Castillo's message may have resonated with many Peruvians and caused panic in others, it's not clear that Castillo will be able to implement his policies in the manner in which he has promised. In fact, the most likely scenario for the country's next 5 years can be summarized in one word: desgobierno. He will face high levels of opposition from a newly elected Congress, which will be largely against him. Peru Libre won 37 out of 130 seats in the legislative. That's Pedro Castillo's party. And there will only be one other leftist party, Juntos por el Perú, which only obtained 5 seats. The other 8 parliamentary caucuses are all center-right or right-wing, which will make most of his promises very difficult to uphold. So he has legislative barriers to his ambitious economic agenda, but there's also the threat that the opposition could simply remove him from power. Here's Moncada again. Quote, there's also the threat of presidential impeachment. Ever since Martín Vizcarra was deposed from the presidency in 2020 on the grounds of, quote, moral incapacity, impeaching a president has become a viable option for many Peruvians. So much so that during the campaign, many voters unwilling to support Keiko Fujimori but still afraid of Castillo's policies argued that it was better for him to be elected because he would be easier to remove from office. A line of reasoning that no doubt many elected parliamentarians already have in mind, considering that it only takes 52 votes in Congress to admit a motion to discuss the possibility of impeachment. But beyond the immediate constraints put on him by Peru's political system, Castillo will face the structural constraints that any leftist leader faces when trying to institute reforms within a global capitalist system, namely the discipline imposed by capital flight. In the wake of Castillo's victory, the Financial Times was explicit about this. They wrote, quote, the prospect of a Castillo victory has sparked panic and capital flight among the Peruvian elite. The sol, the currency, has depreciated further against the dollar than any other currency in the world since the first round of voting in April, when Castillo first emerged as a frontrunner. Dollar-sol transactions have jumped by about 20% in the past month. The sol, which has depreciated sharply in recent weeks in anticipation of a possible Castillo victory, lost more than 2% against the dollar to trade at an all-time low of 3.93. Peruvian stocks plummeted, with the S&P BVL Peru General Index roughly 7% lower on the day in New York. The country's dollar bonds also came under pressure. The price of a note set to mature in 2050 dropped roughly 2% to 129 cents on the dollar. Another dollar bond maturing in 2031 fell more than 1% to 99 cents on the dollar. Quote, we anticipate volatility for Peruvian assets and note that demonstrations against results from both sides is a possibility given the tightness of the race, Citibank noted. And that is the game right there. It's so hard for left-wing leaders to implement their reforms because capital can discipline them by essentially wrecking the economy in the short term. This is what happened with Allende in Chile, for example, with Nixon's famous order to, quote, make the economy scream. And Castillo is already being forced to play ball. This is from the same FT article. Quote, in an apparent bid to calm markets, Castillo's team issued a statement outlining its economic plans. It was far more moderate than the campaign manifesto of his party, Peru Libre. We have not considered nationalization, expropriation, confiscation of savings, exchange controls, price controls, or import prohibitions in our economic plan, the statement read. Castillo's team said it would respect the autonomy of the central bank, which has done a good job of keeping inflation low for more than 2 decades. It confirmed, however, that as president, Castillo would seek to raise taxes on mining companies to pay for health and education spending. Still, despite all of that, Castillo's victory is a stunning win for the Latin American left, which is having a bit of a comeback. AMLO's Morena party won a big victory in the midterm elections in Mexico. And we spoke about Chile and the left's victory in electing a new constituent assembly to write a new constitution. The left resisted the right-wing coup in Bolivia. Colombia is seeing massive street protests against the right-wing neoliberal government. And there is, of course, the prospect of Lula returning to Brazil. The more victories, the better, as they will need regional cooperation to resist the assaults from the more powerful north and the tyranny of financial capital. Castillo's victory is already being challenged, though. Keiko Fujimori alleges that the election was stolen. Does that sound familiar? And that there were 200,000 ballots that need to be invalidated. You know, the usual things. We saw how effective that was to derail Evo Morales' victory in Bolivia. But while we must remain vigilant, it does look like Castillo's victory will hold, and it will be fascinating to see how far he was able to go in reforming Peru.
Well, Nando, first, I would regret not mentioning how well played your Fujimori Apple joke was. It was very good.
I didn't know if that one landed or not.
It landed. I laughed for sure. But, you know, so I had been following the story, but I did not read up about what he had said or what his party had said regarding the central bank allegedly keeping inflation down and all of that. And so it's frustrating. But I think you bring up a really important point about how difficult it will be to pass reforms legislatively. And, you know, I guess my point is, oftentimes, and we do this a lot in American politics as well, especially on the left, like you hear what the candidates are proposing. We want, you know, big reform. We want big change right off the bat. But oftentimes what gets left out of the conversation is the process in which you get the reforms, right? And the legislative battles that stand in the way, the systemic, you know, the structure of the government kind of standing in the way of real reform. We see it in the United States. It's certainly true of this election where Castillo won by such a tiny margin, to be honest, right? So the voters are split, and I'm happy that Fujimori did not win, especially given the fact that she was so brazen about wanting to pardon her father if she gets elected. But one other thing I want to bring up is the private media, the corporate media, in covering this election was very similar to what we experience here with the corporate media, where they fear-mongered about Castillo. There was a lot of nonsense about, oh, he wants to turn Peru into Venezuela. I mean, same conservative talking points that we hear in the United States. And so I think that did do a little bit of damage to his campaign, but he still managed to win. So that's certainly some good news.
Yeah. And, you know, I mentioned briefly AMLO's party's victory in the midterm elections, which was also pretty remarkable. It was one of the largest elections held in Mexico ever. They've done a reform to consolidate as many elections as they can, and you know, AMLO is kind of a predecessor to this new wave of Latin American left resurgence. And one thing that we're seeing with his administration is just absolute total opposition from the domestic media and the global media, like to a degree that is remarkable. More than I can remember in any other situation. And if you look at like his actual record, I mean, he's done some progressive things, but it's not like he's not like Hugo Chavez or anything like that. He's nowhere near as pugilistic and even authoritarian in some degrees as Chavez was. But like, it's just like blanket wall-to-wall coverage of just this, like, you know, painting him as this comically inept and dangerous populist authoritarian. And I think part of it, I mean, outside of the usual kind of thing that anyone in the global South who is like even a little bit left of center is just completely demonized. But it is this thing that he and Pedro Castillo both have, in which they do not perform, for lack of a better term, the PMC thing. They don't do that. They just like, they don't care about that. You know, they don't care about the stylistic kind of embrace of cultural norms and attitudes that you know, kind of urban educated people have, the people who are in the media. You know, and I can't help but think that there's a huge kind of class resentment that is directed to them by members of the media who see them as like, you know, basically like hillbillies, you know, like they're from the country, you know what I mean? So it's been interesting to see that these are the type of people who have won in Latin America. I mean, you know, we covered the elections in Ecuador, which the left lost to a comically like right-wing banker guy named Guillermo Lasso, like a rich banker. And that candidate, Andrés Arauz, was kind of a PMC, you know, spoke perfect English, wore a suit and tie, you know what I mean? Like, even though like like he was, you know, he was good on everything. He just didn't have that kind of common touch that someone like Pedro Castillo or AMLO have. And it's interesting. It's interesting that that's the dynamic at play here, that the candidates who do well on the left are rooted in the working class, come from the working class, and reflect, and people feel themselves reflected in them.
Yeah. I mean, people are going to vote for individuals that they can feel they can relate to. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to just bring up one other thing that you mentioned, you know, in regard to Castillo and his more, I guess, conservative leaning views on some social issues like drug legalization and all of that. You know, those issues I do find to be important. However, I do caution against politicians who specifically run on those issues and avoid running on issues pertaining to, you know, the economic anxiety that people are facing. So, you know, not to compare the United States to Peru, but just to give an example in our own context here in the United States. I mean, you look at the Democratic Party and how Biden, for instance, ran on being this like decent person, this great guy who believes in love and equality and unity for all. And what we're seeing with his Justice Department right now is a full-blown defense of the awful policies that were implemented by the Trump administration, including this whole notion of providing cover for private companies or private schools that receive federal funding but still discriminate against the LGBTQ community. If you're receiving federal funding, you are supposed to be bound by federal laws, you know, in regard to discrimination and all of that. Biden's DOJ, under the leadership of Merrick Garland, is essentially saying, no, don't worry, private schools that are receiving federal funding. We believe in religious liberty. We are 100% on your side. And so if you choose to be discriminatory in any way toward any group of people, and as long as you cite religious liberty as the reason, we've got your back. And it just shows you how hollow, you know, especially with the Democratic Party, that campaign strategy really is. It's nothing more than a strategy. When push comes to shove, they don't actually do what they're supposed to do to improve the lives of the very people they claim to care about, you know?
Yeah. And the thing with these social issues is that they're called social issues for a reason, in that like they're issues that the society kind of has to decide on their own, like differently from economic issues, in which there are more powerful interests at play, you know, namely capital and multinational corporations, and you know all that stuff, like where the only thing that you know you have against them is sort of people power. You know, what social issues like really have to come from the society themselves, and you know, like I think in the United States, there's this feeling that, okay, maybe you can unite certain people around, you know, an agenda that might be kind of economically populist but socially conservative. And maybe I'm not sure that that's the case, but in Peru, it wasn't. There wasn't that really. That's not really the dynamic that happened. There was this huge divide between the rural areas and the urban centers, which is the exact opposite of what is happening in the rest of the democracies, in which the rural areas are getting more and more reactionary and increasingly voting for right-wing parties, whereas the urban centers are voting for kind of center left parties. Here it was in Latin America, and it often happens, it's the complete opposite. So there isn't like this, it's not like he's uniting you know, like fascisty type hyper nationalists with you know, rural workers. He's really just like concentrating on running up the score in these rural areas, which probably do, you know, a lot of these peasant communities, mining communities just have conservative views on social issues. And like, what are you going to do? Like, that's why they're social issues. You have to kind of, the society has to evolve with them. Like if you just kind of outpace them, you're just going to lose. And you know, like there's just no, and it's not like in Latin America, there is like this bastion of like, you know, Latin America has, this is not a Peru specific thing. I mean, I think only like 20% of Latin American countries have marriage equality, and you know, abortion is illegal almost everywhere in Latin America.
Yeah.
So this isn't like a specific thing to Peru. It is a Latin American thing on the whole.
I mean, just think about what Obama very transparently said during his interview with Ezra Klein, where he talked about his campaign strategy. And he's like, I just didn't talk about the fact that I'm Black. I didn't talk about these social issues. I focused on economic issues. And that's what appealed to voters. He found something that united most voters, which was concerns about the economy. And he focused his campaigning on that. Now, obviously, when he was elected into office, his actions were very different from what he campaigned on. But nonetheless, you know, you can see, you know, that dynamic at play in various democracies. And I think you're right.
Well, we just saw a friend of the show, Paul Prescott of the Weekday show, chimed in the comments. AMLO said abortion wasn't going to be a priority, but in office, he's been the most progressive on the issue in Mexico's history. Sometimes strategic decisions need to be made to win power. So yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of that is going to happen with Castillo as well.